Welcome to our webinar from the Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Tennessee. It is my great pleasure to introduce Marianne Wanamaker, our speaker today. She is the Associate Professor of Economics at University of Tennessee, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the former chief domestic economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisor. You are in for a treat. This is an amazing time, as all of us know, to talk about the economic changes and impacts to supply chain. And Marianne is uniquely positioned to help guide us through this discussion. So Marianne, I'm going to hand it over to you if you are ready to share your screen.
Okay, I think I successfully accomplished that. Thank you, Mary. It's really it's a pleasure to be here and not a pleasure all at the same time. I'm happy to be speaking to this group, which has been planned for many months, but I'm not thrilled about the topic. Obviously, this is a really challenging time in the U.S. economy, a really challenging time for policymakers, and economists are really struggling, I think, to try to help guide policy and behavior. And so I'm going to share with you some insights. I hope they're insights. I think this will be a learning experience for you. It's certainly been a learning experience for me in the last few days, just trying to get this information together to share. Okay, so the first thing is that I think it's really important to recognize what we're experiencing right now began as a supply shock. So if you'll remember back to the third week of March, as all of this was really starting to build out, we were having these conversations about what portion of the American population can work from home and what portion cannot. And that framing is a supply shock framing. We were having a conversation about the share of Americans who could produce under the current circumstances, but we weren't yet having a conversation about how much or what sort of reductions we might see and how much Americans would consume. And the intensity of that supply shock and what I would argue is a pretty suboptimal federal response to that supply shock has now pushed us into a demand shock. We are now having exactly that conversation about what Americans can consume and not just what they can produce. And so it won't be a surprise to any of you listening that we are now, of course, in a full-blown recession. The damage is widespread. So let me try to orient you to this slide. I've struggled with how to present this information in the most intuitive way, and this is my best solution so far. So these are sectors of the Tennessee economy. This is just the economy for which I have data. And each of these red bars represents the share of the Tennessee population employed in each one of these industries. Not all industries are on this figure, but these are the major industries in the Tennessee economy. And the light blue bar is the share of unemployment insurance applications for the early weeks of the crisis. So this is the week ending March 21st, which was really the first surge in unemployment insurance. And you can see in this figure that many of these fields or these industries saw UI applications that were well behind their share of overall employment. Okay, and of course, what was happening during this period was that leisure and hospitality was leading the way. You can see that on the far right side. So the early periods, the first weeks of the crisis, really conformed to our supply shock story, where it said, well, it's leisure and hospitality that's really suffering because these are people who can't work from home and for whom there's no demand because people aren't going to restaurants, aren't traveling, and aren't going to hotels. And then what you can see happened in very short order. So by the week ending April 4th, and I just saw the data for the week ending April 11th, and it looks exactly the same. You can see the damage spreading, right? All of these industries are seeing UI applications roughly in proportion to their share of the overall Tennessee employment. And so while leisure and hospitality was kind of the dominant share in that first week of UI applications, by now leisure and hospitality looks much closer to its overall share. And so this is what I mean by a widespread demand shock. You're seeing layoffs in education and health services that roughly mimic share of the population. Same for trade, transportation, and utilities. And if you had said at the beginning, what sectors would we think would be immune from this, right? Education and health services is certainly one of the first things you would have said. So what's happened now is it's not a question about who can work from home, and instead it's a question about what demand for people's services still exists. Okay. The other thing I want to make sure is super clear is that small businesses require a lifeline in these circumstances. So these are results that I'm showing you here from a survey of small businesses that was completed by a group of researchers at MIT and just released earlier this week. And what it shows you is that for all sized small businesses, so these are businesses with fewer than 500 employees, of all revenue sizes, the amount of kind of capital on hand is remarkably small. Okay, so at the median, the green bars that you see here, small businesses have less than 1 month of operating cash on hand. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have lines of credit that they can tap. Certainly they do, but it's pretty clear that there's no way private capital is going to be able to fuel these small businesses through what is likely to be several months worth of slowdown, right? So there had to be a small business bailout, and that, of course, was the Congress's PPP program, which we'll talk about in just a second. So if you think about the policy response to this, I really think you can kind of cleanly divide it into 3 parts, and it roughly mimics the branches of government, except we're going to sub out the judiciary branch and sub in the Federal Reserve. Okay, so the first part of the policy response, I would call the executive branch, and I'm going to include in the executive branch state and local governments, because really the federal executive branch, state and local governments are all working on the same sets of issues. And those issues are, of course, personal protective equipment, testing and tracing strategies, and a national economic strategy for when are we going to shut down, when are we going to reopen, what industries are we going to allow to operate. At the same time, Congress has been operating on a relief package. Don't call it a stimulus package. You can't stimulate this economy, right? Instead, what you're doing at the moment is just trying to provide relief. And that, of course, culminated in the massive CARES Act bill that was passed at the end of March. And then the Federal Reserve has been doing 2 things. One is they've been executing traditional monetary policy. So you saw early in this crisis, at the beginning of March, you saw the Federal Reserve ratcheting down interest rates, which is, of course, their traditional way of executing stimulus to the economy. And at the same time, they've undergone this massive market continuity operation, otherwise known as quantitative easing part 4, where they've stepped into a bunch of different markets and tried to stabilize those markets. And I'm going to show you some evidence about that in a minute. The Federal Reserve is also embarked on a quest to lend money directly to businesses, which I'm not really going to talk about today, but that's a new activity for them and one that they are really leaning into. Estimates as high as $4 trillion out of Federal Reserve lending will be forthcoming over the course of this year. So if you're as old as I am, then your natural this crisis is to think about how it compares to the 2008 recession, which up until now was the biggest crisis of my lifetime. And I just want to remind everyone, and maybe it's obvious, the scale of this crisis is much bigger than the 2008 crisis. In the 2008-2009 downturn, unemployment in this country peaked at 10%, which corresponds to roughly 15 million simultaneously unemployed Americans. Okay, so many more than 15 million experienced unemployment over the course of the crisis, but in a given month, the maximum number of people unemployed was 15 million. Right now, what we're seeing is, and with today's numbers, I should revise this already. The numbers that came out this morning, this is down a little bit, but we're currently pacing about 6 million new unemployment claims per week. right? So if you do the quick math, what you can see is that we are, in short order, within 2.5 weeks, generating the unemployment, the same volume of unemployment that we saw in the 2008-2009 crisis, which of course lasted many months, right? So the pace of this is just extraordinary. The best estimates I have seen of the unemployment rate as of not even really today, but as of about a week ago, is more than 20%. So if I had to update this with the information that we got this morning, that number is probably closer to 25%. We've never seen anything like that in this country, at least not in the last 90 to 100 years. You can see the scale of the UI claims on this slide. So believe it or not, there is a bar on the far right side, which is a data point. And those two data points, this is not updated through this morning. I'm not that good, but these are the data points that came through the last 2 Thursdays when the Department of Labor released unemployment insurance claims, and you can see just how out of the ordinary those 2 weeks were relative to our recent history. All right, now the crisis is massive, but I think the good news is that the response has also been massive. So the CARES Act, again signed, I believe, March 24th, was just the government spending part of that. Okay, so just the part that Congress was going to spend was 2.5 times what they spent in the 2008 crisis. Right, so the 2008 bailouts totaled about $800 billion. The $2 trillion that Congress committed to spending last month is 2.5 times that. That is not accounting for what the Fed has promised to spend, which is another $4 trillion. So really, you can think about this as a $6 trillion package, so many multiples of what we spent in 2008 to try to stabilize the economy. The Fed has really taken the lead here. So Congress's CARES Act is big, it's massive. The Fed's interventions are even greater. And again, they're coming in many flavors. We have an interest rate that's effectively zero. We have a commitment from the Fed to lend to businesses. And then we also have an increase in what's known as quantitative easing, which is the Fed's purchase of assets on the open market. And the idea here is that the Fed really wants to stabilize financial markets of all types. So that includes lending markets. It includes, at the moment, it's including mortgage markets. And I've heard some chatter that, if things get bad enough, the Fed may actually purchase stocks outright. You can see the scale of the Fed's interventions in this figure. So we began quantitative easing in this country, this kind of outright purchase of assets by the Federal Reserve during the financial crisis. And so what you can see on this figure is the weekly change in the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. So in other words, how many assets is the Federal Reserve buying every week? And there was a huge uptick in that at the end of 2008, running into 2009, when they launched QE1. They relaunched quantitative easing at the end of 2010, although at a much smaller scale, and then again in 2013 and 2014, again at a very small scale relative to QE1. What has happened in the last couple of weeks is that the Fed has undergone an asset buying operation that dwarfs what they did in 2008, 2009. So for the week ending April 1st, you can see the peak on the far right side of this slide. They nearly doubled what they were spending at the peak of their QE1 operations at the end of 2008. So it has been a massive intervention. What can we say about the prospect for recovery? So there are many different ways to show the same information, but what I've chosen to show you here is people's response to a Pew Research Center survey, asking them whether all of these restrictions on economic activity have been necessary. And so you can see that for all of these different restrictions, international travel, canceling major sports entertainment events, closing K-12 schools, avoiding groups of 10 or more, limiting restaurants to carry out, and requiring most businesses to close, that the share of Americans who agree that these were necessary steps in all cases exceeds 70%. if you survey people, if you ask them more sort of open-ended questions or even more subjective questions like, were the economy to open tomorrow, would you feel comfortable coming out, right, and going about your regular activities? People's answers to that have been similar to this, right? In other words, 20 or 30% of the population says, yes, I'd go back to my former activity, and the rest of us respond by saying, no, we would not. So both of those data points, or all of these data points, lead to this conclusion that it's not the government restrictions that are limiting economic behavior at the moment, right? It's people's perceptions about the safety of returning to their previous activities that has generated this demand shock. And therefore, simply lifting those restrictions and having governors of all 50 states stand up and say, okay, I'm taking the restrictions off. You no longer have to shelter in place. Please return to your previous activities is simply not going to cut it. And instead, you're going to have to convince American consumers and workers, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a little bit, but both consumers and workers that it is now safe to return to work. And that requires a national testing strategy where we can track people who are infected, quarantine them, and ensure people who show up to a business or to a school that being there is not a threat to their personal safety. I would argue that we are nowhere near that, and so therefore we are nowhere near a full economic recovery. Now, I know many of you are wondering what the restart is going to look like. I am too. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And as an economist, I think it's worth saying that every actor in this play is going to end up evaluating marginal cost and marginal benefit from their activities going forward, right? And so we're going to really be thinking hard, all of us, about what is the return to social interaction in a particular setting. Okay. And those settings or activities where it really has to be done in person with social interaction and where there's a really high return to that are the ones that are going to get prioritized for testing and for reopening. And those interactions that seem quite luxurious or voluntary at this point and that don't have a super high economic return are going to end up being the things that are last to return to normal. So let me try to be super clear about what I'm saying. So the industries where there is a really high return to working in person, I expect to see these prioritized for testing and to be some of the first to reopen and return to normal. The first place I expect to see the federal government put some effort is in the food supply chain. So I'm sure I do not have to tell you guys that the food supply chain has become, over the last week to 10 days, much more fragile than I think the federal government is comfortable with. There have been a number of reported meat manufacturers or meat processors who have had to shut down. A couple of more I read this morning, pork processors had to shut down because the transmission of COVID-19 within the plant has gotten out of control. In addition, we're seeing issues with farm labor supply and an overall growing season, that the planting season has been missed in many industries, right? And so I really expect food supply chain to be a place where we put a lot of effort on testing and reopening. I expect to see the same intensity of activity in the healthcare system beyond COVID-19. For example, my father is a physician and he spent much of this week laying off his nurses because they are in primary care and are not seeing the sort of activity they need to remain open. That is not likely to continue over the long run. Individuals who have chronic conditions or who need surgeries, even if they're not emergency surgeries, cannot wait that out for months at a time. So I expect to see some effort at reopening the healthcare system beyond the COVID-19 crisis. And then I think I'm ready to take the question mark off of K-12 education. I think you're going to see a massive effort on the part of federal, state, and local governments to reopen K-12 education in August. I've been skeptical from the beginning that we would actually see kids go back to school in August, but I'm starting to turn the corner. And I think the reason is that people recognize that until kids are back in school, the labor market cannot recover. Parents can't work with their kids at home, I'm here to tell you. And their productivity is taking a huge hit. And so if we're really serious about getting the economy back to normal, K-12 education has got to be a priority. So I expect to see a lot of effort there. When I say I expect to see a lot of effort there, I mean over the next several months, right? It's not going to happen tomorrow because we don't have the testing capacity. But as we build the testing capacity, this is where I expect to see the initial effort. On the other hand, industries where work from home has been minimally disruptive, I think will continue to work from home until testing is truly pervasive and infections are truly low. So unfortunately, I think one of the industries that you could put in this category would be higher education. Although it feels very disruptive as an undergraduate professor to be teaching my students over Zoom, in the end, they are still making progress and we are still granting credit hours and degrees at the University of Tennessee. And so as much as I hate it, it is probably still minimally disruptive. And I expect that higher ed will be a very low priority in terms of getting things back to normal. And then there are going to be a set of industries who are going to be semi-permanently altered. And what I mean by semi-permanently here is that you're not going to see these industries come back to full capacity until you have a vaccine and until that vaccine has been shown to work. Okay, so we've been speaking as though this kind of 18-month timeline to a vaccine is this magic 18 months. And once everybody has the vaccine, they're going to go back to normal. And I'm not convinced that even that is true. I think people are going to want to see evidence that the vaccine works before they're willing to go back to a packed restaurant, to get back on an airplane, or to do kind of standard travel. And I think you will see both business and leisure travel take a hit. So for example, Microsoft has announced for the next year that there are to be no meetings of Microsoft staff. And so they are already planning for a severe reduction in business travel that will extend well past December of 2020 and will extend probably at least through Q2 of 2021. Okay, Mary, that's all I have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I think we're queuing up some questions, and I'm looking forward to this part. This is always my favorite part. I don't want to talk at you. I want to be in conversation with you. So I'm looking forward to the questions.
Yes. We are already getting some questions in, and then I do want everyone to know who's on the live stream, go to slido.com. We'll try to get that slide up for you to access, but it is www.slido.com, and the event code is GSCI 2020. And some of we already have some people quick on the draw. And Marianne, thank you so much. There is so much to unpack there. And I know that the first question people will have is, can we share those slides? So
yes, there's nothing, I have permission from the state of Tennessee to share all of that UI data. So yes, you can share.
Okay, great. Then I'll start off with, you talked a bit about this, and you ended with this too, but what's the likelihood of this causing long-lasting damage to the economy that stretches years, like the Great Depression? So that's kind of the theme you ended with. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not going to measure this recovery in months. It's at least quarters, and it's probably years. So I think the easiest way to think about that is, where do I expect we're going to be in Q4 of 2020 relative to Q4 of 2019? Okay, and so my gut here is that the best we can hope for is that by the end of Q4 2020, we're at 90% of where we were Q4 2019. Okay, in other words, we will have had a 10% drop off in GDP. And then if you think about how long is it going to take you, suppose that's your baseline, okay? And then you need to grow back from that 10% deficit. And under any circumstance, I think the process of getting from 10% down back to even is going to take us, again, not months and probably not even quarters, but potentially years. We're looking at a really long recovery.
Okay. Well, thank you. The questions are popping in really quickly, so I'll juggle between moving these over so that we can get to them. One that I think you're, uniquely qualified to help us unpack is what's the assessment of the federal government response so far? So it was a balance in what you talked about with the scope of that response. When I think of the PPP and that 75% of that is supposed to go to labor and wages, how do we manage then with this also 22 million unemployment? Like, how do you assess what does the government do next then?
It's really hard. So we gave the labor market a super muddled message in the CARES Act, right? We said simultaneously we want employees to stay where they are with their small employer. Right. And at the same time, we said, but if you leave, we're going to offer you these super generous unemployment payments. Right. And so what you hear from small businesses is that their employees are begging to be laid off. They don't want to stay because if they stay, at best they're going to earn what they were earning before. At worst, many of these are taking a haircut, right? So your option is stay where you were and earn 75% of your former earnings, or be laid off, be furloughed, and go on UI. And in the state of Tennessee, it's looking like at least 60% of people are better off on UI than they would be if they stayed with their employer, just in terms of the earnings power. So we really, I feel, should have said to employers early at the very beginning, hold your employees. We will pay them, we'll make up the difference between what you can pay them and what they would have earned, and use UI as a distant backup, right? That would have been my preference. And then you have not severed the relationship between employers and employees, right? And you haven't pushed a bunch of people onto UI from which they're going to be hesitant to come back because, again, it is super generous at this point. We did a calculation the other day that if you had a 2-earner household, both of whom are laid off and are earning UI in the state of Tennessee, their annualized income is $95,000 a year. Okay, it is remarkably generous. Now, that's not necessarily wrong, but it is ultimately going to be really hard to get people to come back from UI to a really weak labor market. So I'm worried about that. The issue is, once you've said that this is our policy, it's really hard to reverse. So as Congress is thinking about what are we going to do in the next step, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for Congress to say, we're going to need to ratchet down this UI benefit over time. Right? That is politically going to be very difficult. What I've been lobbying for is that we start thinking about UI as being an industry-specific thing. Okay? So if you're in an industry such as the restaurant industry, where we know that market is not returning to normal anytime soon, then these generous UI subsidies make a lot of sense. But if you're in an industry where the state and local governments have said it's time to go back, right? Then we need to somehow figure out a way to kind of ratchet down support over time to help push people back into the labor supply.
A related question to that, tagging on, is with that huge stimulus package, what impact do you think this will have on inflation then once we're truly moving back to normal?
So if you believe me that we're going to be at 90% of 2019 GDP by Q4 of 2020, then you're not worried about inflation, right? In fact, what you're worried about is deflation, and it's remarkable to me the number of conversations I've had in the last few days about deflation. I haven't thought about deflation since I was in college, and we talked about Japan, right? Deflation was always like the Great Depression in Japan. That was it. right? And now I think we're facing a real threat of deflation. I've been seeing that even some branches of the University of Tennessee are offering summer school at reduced tuition rates. That is deflation, right? And so I expect that to become more widespread, and the Fed, I'm certain, is terrified of that outcome.
Okay. All right. What are we're getting upvotes here. So what are the potential effects on demand if we get multiple waves of this disease, like what happened with Spanish flu?
Yeah, we're going to have multiple waves. I mean, there's no question about that. And the strategy of reopening, well, once you've said we're reopening the economy, then you have guaranteed waves, right? Because we're going to overshoot in some places, and we're going to have outbreaks that are then going to require us to move back to more extreme social distancing rules. And though that's going to happen place by place. In addition, we may end up with this wave in October or November, a nationwide wave that's related to seasonality. So we should all be prepared. We are certainly at my house prepared to be cycling in and out of homeschooling, of on-campus restrictions, of teaching online. I'm prepared even if UT it is in person at the beginning of August. I think by October we'll be back online again. And so we need to all be prepared for that. And I think from a policy perspective, it makes this reliance on unemployment insurance, again, not optimal, right? Because unemployment insurance is hard to get on. People who filed for unemployment in the week of March 21st in Tennessee are just now seeing their first checks 1 month later. And so if you think we're going to cycle in and out of this over time, right, then throwing people out of their jobs and back on UI with a 1 month lag and getting any income, and then back to their jobs and then back on UI is just enormously disruptive. And it's going to be really hard especially for lower income Americans, to be able to manage that volatility in income. So I think Congress is going to have to come up with another plan for how to make people financially whole. They're going to have to get money to people much faster than they're currently accomplishing.
Thanks. This is a question that's come up often in conversation. You know, there's so much information out there for all of us, just as consumers, as business people. Do you have recommendations for us on where to go for insights and data that we should follow? You know.
Well, I just weaned my father-in-law off of cable news and onto Twitter. I'm a big believer in Twitter. Okay. I really am. I think the rate of fake news on Twitter is really low. I think the rate of fake news on Facebook is really high. So if you prefer to consume your news through social media, which is not really how I prefer to consume it, I'll say more about that in a second. But if you've got to do it on social media, can you please make it Twitter and not Facebook? Okay, that's rule number one. And then the second rule is turn your TV off. Okay, because that's not helping you. The TV is just making you outraged, right? But it's not actually informing you very well. And then I think that the really the big way that you can avoid misinformation is to have a disciplined news routine. So I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I read the Knoxville Compass, which is a daily news source from some journalists in Knoxville. I read it every day. And then I read the Washington Post most days, right? And so then if something appears that doesn't seem to comport to my priors, right? I have this kind of background in what the news has been the last few days that allows me to discern what's likely to be true and what's likely not to be true, right? But if you don't put that discipline in place of reading the same sources every day, then I think it is easy to see stuff and think, oh, this must be true, or this might be true, right? If you don't have that background. So I think we've become less disciplined in our news consumption over time. And I'm hoping that things like the COVID-19 crisis, that the silver lining on stuff like this is that it forces us back into those more disciplined patterns. Good question.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. I can imagine that's going to be one of our quotes and tips coming out of this for sure, because it's just, it helps us process through all this information. So good. Switching gears here, we have one for you on, so this density of living and the working conditions seem to be really driving hotspots. Do you see a larger issue where the migration of living to cities stops and may even reverse? So like, would it be that an outcome is we start to consider the value of being more rural?
I think to some extent. I mean, I think what's really going to drive that, I think we've always been interested in being less urban. People have always been interested in having space, right? But the constraint on that has been job availability where you are, right? So I would love to live in the middle of nowhere, but my job does not allow me to live in the middle of nowhere, right? And there are many Americans for whom that's true. So I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is it's not so much going to be that people are trying to avoid viral infections by living in the middle of nowhere. It's going to be that telecommuting and telework and remote working is going to become more viable as a result of this. The technology is only going to get better. Our experience with it has proven in some cases to be really positive. Right. And so I think employers are going to be more open to, I don't live near this business, but I'm going to work for this business from where I am. And once you have those, if those are the facts, right, then I think you will see people disinvest in living downtown and increasingly choose to live further from their place of work. Yeah, good question.
I do have to pause 1 minute because one of the questions we got was that we're matching. And, so, this is what happens when you use Zoom and you get there and we're like, this will be great.
Everybody wants to be like Mary, so there you go.
Oh, no, it's the other way for sure. So kind of related to what you just talked about, one of the questions is, this huge social experiment of working from home, what do you think are going to be the long-term labor implications of this?
I mean, I do think it's going to open up more jobs to remote work. Now, what I think is really important to note, though, is that all of our positive experiences began with in-person working where we had built relationships, and then we were thrust into this remote system, right? And so a great way of thinking about that, for me anyway, is thinking about my classes. So I had 9 weeks with these students in person, and we developed a relationship, and I knew who they were. And then when we got pushed to online, we muddled through. It wasn't great, but it was fine. But the reason it was fine was that I already knew them. And the same thing is true in many work, in many work examples, right? You already know these people, they're your colleagues, you've been to work with them every day, and now you get pushed to remote work and you have already established a rapport that allows you to do this. But if you think about starting fresh from remote, so taking a new hire and never having that new hire come in the office, or for us in August, taking a new class of students whom we will never share space with and instead try to instruct over Zoom, I think the results from those experiments, I expect to be much, much weaker. So I think a hybrid is in our future, right? Where we do meet in person 1 week a month, or we are together for a few days a week, but we aren't necessarily together all the time. Yeah.
Right. Some of the things I've heard that companies are doing or planning as they try to think about restarting are alternating days or even alternating floors of people who would come back, like trying to figure out a way to ease into it. But to your point earlier, it's testing, it's that they don't want to create a liability for themselves going too quickly and being ahead of whatever the government recommends. Kind of along a similar line, I'm going to jump to one about hiring interns and co-ops as virtual hires. What are the pros and cons from your perspective?
Well, I mean, the pros are almost purely philanthropic at this point, right? Like if I think about outside of people who have gotten sick, Okay. If I think about the people who have suffered the most from COVID-19, it's college students. Yeah. They only had 4 years. And we've been preaching at them from the minute they got on campus that, like, you maximize your time. College is short. You have a lot to accomplish. It's a competitive job market. You need to prove yourself, right? And now we've taken from them a whole year of opportunity, really. And it breaks my heart. And I think keeping some normalcy of internships and co-ops and allowing them to experience this culture, whatever it is, as broken as this is, right? Allowing them some insight into the work world, I still think is super valuable, and it helps them feel like there's some normalcy to be had at the end of this. At the same time, I wouldn't expect them to be productive, right? It's really hard to, just from my perspective, it's really been hard to manage graduate students in this environment, to have meaningful conversations with undergraduates, especially those that I didn't know beforehand, has been super challenging. So I think you do it kind of as a going through the motions exercise. I'm not sure that you expect a huge return from it, but I think that's okay.
Right. There's an upcoming session within supply chain of leading educators. Actually, shout out to Ted Stank. He'll be on that panel, and they're going to be sharing with each other and with a broader community what are the learnings we've had so far. And actually, sitting in this role of, I was over 25 years in industry, and now I'm in academia. I see tremendous value in what we've learned, trying to convert all these classes and trying to engage with students in a way that really makes them want to learn. This is what practitioners are going to need, because they'll need talent. If their business is growing, they'll need talent, and they will probably have to figure out how to make this dance work, to bring people on and get them engaged with teams. So I think we have from my perspective, I think there's insights that your painful experience of moving things online, like all of ours, I think there's stuff we could share. All right, so going back to Tennessee, like the specific information you shared about the Tennessee economy, Tennessee being a sales-only tax state generally has a strong reaction to both GDP increases and crashes. How will this stunning stoppage impact the Tennessee economy and state budget over the next years?
It's going to be awful. I mean, I wish I had some other way of saying that. It is going to be awful. I mean, you're right that the way the tax system in Tennessee is structured makes us more vulnerable to things like this. At the same time, Tennessee is an extraordinarily well-run state, meaning that we have built up substantial reserves, and we do have exceptional credit ratings and borrowing histories. So I'm worried. At the same time, I'm very thankful for the previous efforts that the state has taken to be in a good position to ride this out. I also anticipate that the feds will bail out the states. There's really no question about that. I think the only question is, how big will it be? But it will have to happen. If you just go back for just a second and think about the size of the federal response, if you measure it as $6 trillion, which I'm willing to measure the relief package as a $6 trillion relief package, it's effectively 1/3 of GDP. Okay, so what the federal government has said is, like, we expect to need to fill a hole the size of 1/3 of the economy, right? And so if you translate that to a state level, there's no state that has enough reserves to survive a 33% reduction in their overall activity for the year. No state looks like that, right? Everyone prepares for a 5 or 10% reduction, not 33%. There's just no way that the states can survive without federal intervention.
Okay. Oh, that's a hard message to process, but like so many are. So, I will go to this one kind of relates to what we talked about. So it's clear, this is a situation that's different from a normal recession. And you've talked about how governments need to approach differently. The question is how so? And I think, so basically we're a lot of information of all the things you've talked about. If you could pick, your top three, how would you recap this for us? Like, what should governments focus on now?
A great question. So I think the number one thing is that, shoveling money at people isn't going to ultimately be able to return us to normal, right? Without some fix for the underlying public health issue. So you can send people stimulus checks all day long, but they can't spend them because they're not leaving their house, right? So this is why they've been careful not to call it a stimulus package and to call it a relief package instead. You cannot stimulate an economy in which people don't leave their houses. So the number one most important outcome here for the federal government is the testing system. Even more important than PPE at this point is, can you get the tests on the ground to allow people to return to normal? And there's been a lot of criticism about Congress, that Congress didn't spend any, they put forward this big package, but there wasn't any money for testing. That's because money's not the problem. The tests do not exist at the volume that we need them to exist, right? So if and when they're there, Congress is happy to pay for them, but at the moment they do not exist. And the ones that we do have are not to our accuracy standards, right? So we really have a long way to go on that. So the number one thing is that the executive branch has got to get it together on testing. That's the number one thing. The number two thing is that we have got to put together a public policy response that allows for waves. So we talked about this earlier, but the way we have structured our relief package right now is as though this is a crisis that's going to last to June 30th, which is when the unemployment insurance runs out, and it's when the PPP stuff runs out, right? That we have phrased it as though everybody just hang on to June 30 and then we're good, right? And this thing is going to last longer than June 30, and it's going to come back in cycles. And we have not written down a government policy that allows us to deal with it. So that's one and two. And then the third thing that I would say needs attention and hasn't gotten attention is that there's going to be a huge hangover from debt. Companies are taking on debt like crazy. Households are taking on debt like crazy, right? There's going to be a clamoring for the cancellation of debt at the end of this. Right. And we are going to have to put together some sort of national strategy for how we're going to deal with this. If we don't do that, then climbing out of our hole is going to take longer than it needs to.
Yeah, that's it's definitely the theme. The testing came out. I was reading Bezos' comment on the testing is what they need to bring even more people back. So that another helpful quote there. The next two questions are kind of related. So I'm going to summarize, it's really about, is this the end of the global economy? And because what we've done with borders and what other countries now have borders to try to protect themselves, does that situation continue and make it be that, we are moving away from a global economic model?
I'm pretty skeptical that we will. And the reason is that the returns to globalization are so large. Right now, I think this is a massive crisis, and I think it's going to take us a very long time to recover. So there are huge costs, but at the same time, our global connectivity brings gigantic benefits. So if we face a pandemic every 5 years, then yes, right, then we will effectively close the borders, right? But if this is a once in a lifetime story for us, then I don't expect that this is going to generate any major reductions in globalization. And also remember that it's not the flow of goods and services that spreads the virus. It's the flow of people. And so even if you restrict the flow of goods and services and you say we're gonna right size our supply chains and everything's gonna be domestic and blah blah, even if you did all of that, right, you would still have a flow of people. And so it's not obvious to me that there's a magic way of taking supply chains, shrinking them down, and therefore limiting the spread of the next pandemic. I just don't see that that's the case.
This second part of this question kind of relates more to your area of policy. Would it be cheaper to subsidize companies to have them come back to the U.S. for manufacturing? Or is that something that you see happening more in the future as this progresses, really, is incentives for companies to be U.S. based?
I'd be surprised. So that's a solution. That's a solution to no problem that I see. Okay, so if what is it about having a supply chain based in the U.S. that's going to change the reality of what we're experiencing right now, right? So U.S. manufacturers are closed. Chinese manufacturers are closed. Manufacturers in the rest of Southeast Asia, many of them are closed. Chinese manufacturing is going to be back online before we are, right? That seems pretty clear. And so it's hard for me to see how, again, bringing everything domestically is going to make a huge difference to the outcomes for any multinational corporation in the face of the next pandemic. I also am really skeptical about this story that people are going to diversify away from China, right? That this is too dangerous to be in China. And I know I have supply chain professionals on the line, so I hope some of them will comment in and educate me. But I'm really struggling to see how the solution or how the way forward out of this is to de-invest or disinvest from China and invest somewhere else, U.S. or otherwise. Whatever you think about the truthfulness of the Chinese government, it also is the case that they do have the experience and the capacity to deal with pandemics, and they're outperforming us in terms of a federal response by light years. Right. And so, if you're faced with, I can put this supply chain in China or I can put this supply chain in the U.S., it's not obvious to me that putting in the U.S. is in any sense safer.
Right. I mean, all of what we talk about in supply chain, these are global networks and they're not easily bound, or disconnected. It depends really on the length of time. Right. So, yeah, we'll see. We are getting.
Let me say one other thing. I do think what you're going to see is I think you're going to see people hold more inventory, right? I mean, that's the lesson. It's not like, China is a dangerous place. I think it's like we're susceptible globally to these shutdowns. And so one answer to that is, you hold more inventory. Now, what if I can say one other thing, right? That's a story when you think the problem is a supply shock. Right? Mm-hmm. You hold more inventory to manage your way through a supply shock. If you're a car manufacturer, right, holding more inventory allows you to manage a 2 or 3 week shutdown of your factory in China. But holding more inventory is not going to help you when it turns into a demand shock. Right? Now the car company's problem is not that they can't get parts from China. Now the problem is nobody's buying a car. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's why I loved how you set that up when we were talking about the supply shock and the demand shock and the lead to the impact on recessionary trend. So we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to have you give your thoughts on. There are a couple questions relative to students specifically, and we do have many students on the line. So as a 2020 graduate, what should I expect in terms of entering the labor market as a new hire who has an offer but no set start date? So, and this is going to be a growing thing of delayed start dates or just, many different options companies are trying to figure out. So what would you say both to companies and to these pending new hires?
It's hard. I mean, I don't have any magic answers. I
Yeah.
think, I can tell you what the data say, right? And the data say that if you're a graduate in a recession year, it takes you 10 to 12 years to recover earnings relative to your peers who graduated not in a recession year. So unfortunately, the year in which you graduate from college matters. I'm a recession year graduate myself. Okay. So I'm with you in this. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. And, I think for many of us, the name of the game right now is be super flexible. Be flexible. Take all those expectations that you had about the way your fall was going to look and throw them out the window and be open to whatever it looks like. Right. And I think for students, we've been telling you it's a competitive labor market since you got here, and now you really have to believe it. Now it is crazy competitive.
Right. I'm a recession year graduate as well. And, that statistic definitely helped true. It did lead to why my family and we moved so many times, because I had to be less restrictive about geographically where I was willing to be, because the job was somewhere else. And so then it's a choice of job or be home closer to family. It led us to explore more of America, which was not a bad thing. So, okay. I think we have time for a couple more. So what is your assessment of the federal government response so far? It seems, yeah.
Look, okay, so let me take it back to the president, okay?
Yeah.
Whatever you do or don't like about the president, there's nothing about his background that has prepared him to lead a massive command economy in a crisis. He has no military experience. He's no experience running a large organization, really. Even his business experience has not been as structured as you would want for somebody who's trying to lead this issue. The ideal president in a situation like this is either somebody with extensive military experience or somebody or a governor who has been through a crisis. And he's obviously neither of those things. Moreover, the people who work for him, his kind of primary lieutenants, also don't have this experience set. So if you think about who's leading Health and Human Services or who's leading DHS, none of those people have the right experience. So we really have a leadership vacuum on the executive branch side, and I think you can see that, right? Somebody has got to take the lead on testing, and so far no one is doing that. They're hoping that just by saying the economy is reopened, that it will magically reopen, and of course that's not going to happen. I think they're coming around to that view. There's more language coming out of the White House about testing than there was a week ago, but we're nowhere near where we are. So I think the executive branch has struggled. I think Congress, I don't love the policy they put out, but I give them a ton of credit for recognizing the gravity of the situation. So Congress gets maybe a B+. And then so far, I would say the Federal Reserve is leading the show. A++, I don't see any evidence that they've overstepped or understepped. I think they're taking this seriously and taking all the right steps so far.
Okay. Well, we only have a few minutes left. I do want to, thank you so much for doing this. And I think that, what the emphasis that you brought about on the testing, this idea of things coming in waves, that definitely seems to be the clear message that I've even seen just today, hopefully that's coming out of even these rounds of the more that they reach out to industry, the executive branch, maybe that will get amplified. And actually even doing sessions like this, the more that we educate practitioners and that we have these dialogues together, then I think that helps to get the message more and more out of what is needed by business to make it that we can bring people back into the workplace and do it safely. So let's see, real quick, last shot, do you believe there will be a second round of financial relief coming from the government? And if so, will college students be a part of that?
think there will be another round. I'm not sure there's going to be another round of tax rebate style $1,200 checks, because I think the return to that is pretty limited. Most people are going to take it and pay off debt or pocket it, right? I mean, there's nowhere to spend it. So I think that's not the highest return. And I unfortunately, I don't anticipate that college students are going to benefit from whatever happens next. I think you're a low priority. For what, I'm sorry to say it that way, but I think that's ultimately true.
Well, I mean, that goes to the overall, like we are all in this together from the standpoint of trying to find our way, and there aren't silver bullets. There's not a magic answer to this. So thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. There are so many more questions that we couldn't get to. So thank you everyone who is on the line for submitting such great questions. And Marianne, I can't thank you enough. We will be posting, this will be on our website by Tuesday, the 21st. We will have it captioned so that if that's a need, that will be there as well. And thank you all for joining us at the Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Tennessee for our virtual supply chain forum. See you all later. Thank you.